What's up, everybody? It's Soren Baker here on Unique Access Entertainment. As always, please hit that subscribe button right there. As y'all know, it's free, and that enables us to keep coming to y'all as often as possible with as many interviews as possible. So please hit that subscribe button, like our content, share it, talk about it, be about it, each one, teach one, and we appreciate your guys' support, as always, for helping the channel grow. So today, we have the honor and the privilege being joined by somebody I've been a fan of for a long time, representing the Windy City. I'm very excited. Mr. E.C. Illa, thank you for coming through.
Thank you very much for having me, man.
Yes. So E.C. Illa has many aliases, names, name variations, and all this different stuff. But as we get started here into your career, a lot of the early stuff I saw, it was sometimes E.C., sometimes E.C. Illa, sometimes seemed like E. Silla. So what, as you were first getting into making music and releasing it, why did you kind of vary from these different ways to label and name yourself?
Well, originally it was EC. And when I released, I believe, what would be my fourth album, titled Illa LP. When it was released, that was a lot of people's first interaction with me, first national exposure. So they read it as EC Illa LP. So as in self-titled. And it was kind of coincidental because in Chicago, Illa is actually a nickname. You'll call anybody, you would be Soren Billa or Sorilla. So it was E. Silla as the nickname for EC, but it became EC Illa due to people outside of the city's misinterpretation of how to read the name. So ironically, people outside of Chicago ultimately named me for the back half of my career.
That's hilarious. And similarly, that happened with Silk the Shocker, because his first album was called, his name was Silk, but the album was called The Shocker.
Okay.
And people didn't know that. So I always thought that's hilarious. So now we have part 2 of that.
Correct.
But before we get to the EC Illa LP, getting into the early days of Chicago, you know, I growing up in Maryland, I was familiar with like Mr. Lee and then Twista and these different things that were very different from what obviously Twista ended up doing, even Common Sense ended up doing a little bit later. So for you, I also have lived in Chicago for a couple of years. The city's so musically separated, segregated, just like the city. So for you, what were you really listening to and getting into before you got into making music?
Well, I grew up in a house with a huge record collection. So I was always very interested in music, the record collection, and it was broad array of music, lots of Motown, classic rock, the Kinks, Cat Stevens, the Beatles. So I would listen to these records as a very small child, 5, 6 years old, go to the record player, drop the needle on it, and kind of just, you know, familiarize myself with the record collection in the house. It wasn't in the best shape, but it was broad. There was plenty to listen to. In addition, growing up where I grew up, we listened to a lot of Black radio. So at this time, you know, I was exposed to Sherelle, The Time, the Gap Band, Ready for the World. So I was listening to a wide array of music, but specifically a lot of what would ultimately become classic Black music. And so that's what I grew up listening to. And as hip hop made its way to accessibility, Jam On It, the Roxanne records, and so on, I just gravitated to it. So I was always a student of music, but hip hop was my favorite class. And as I became so deeply interested in all the different elements of hip hop, but rap specifically, it just had my focus so deeply that, like many young people, I tried my hand at it, and it turned out to be, of the elements of hip hop, the one that I excelled in. So that's what we did. There's a whole history to Chicago hip hop pre 1990, but I began recording in 1990. So me, Common Sense, Tongue, Twista, all were similar in age, and were kind of the representations of the different sides of the city. So Twista being from the west side, Common being from the south side, and myself being from up north. And there were other key players. D.A. Smart, had an affiliation with the Zulu Nation, was making his way to New York, with King Son and different other artists. So that's not to leave anybody out, but we were of 91, 92, the ones for our respective sides kind of building on independent careers that would ultimately take us national.
So given that we have the three sides / sections of Chicago, why, as time went on, why do you think the South Side and the West Side really established themselves as these hotbeds with all these artists, whereas you might be the main, only prominent, dominant guy from the North Side?
I think the amount of artists that were coming from those sides exceeded the amount of artists that were coming from up north. I mean, there were still very locally relevant artists from up north, but and I don't want to say labels were seeking anybody from Chicago. You got to understand, at this time, nobody was interested. We were not looked to for rap music. When you're talking about the turn of the decade, 1990, 91, Jive ultimately opens up offices in Chicago, but they're focused on hip house and R. Kelly, and they're going to handle their rap business out of New York. And, Twista was Loud's very first artist. So people didn't have Chicago had no historical relevance in rap. I mean, there were songs out of Chicago, the Duke Rapping Duke, and there were things, but they weren't directly connected with the city, as it were. So it was just a matter of the amount of artistry that was coming from the South Side and the West Side. It was more accessible to the people who were looking for something to invest in. Okay.
And as I got familiar with Chicago and started understanding and hearing about, I remember reading about, but I didn't get initially or didn't hear in the first run, the Invisible Man EP. Is that your first actual project?
Correct. The very first manufactured release. So there were demos, of course, before that. I was getting a lot of love for regional college radio, was embracing it. And I was trying to figure out a way to make my way to these labels in New York. Wasn't obviously, given the time, it was way different. I would have to actually travel. I would have to know somebody, have a meeting. There was no email. The phone calls weren't going to justify, I could send a tape, I suppose, but in order for them to get to know me directly, I was going to need to make my way to New York. I remember setting up a bunch of meetings. This is pre-Invisible Man, so pre the first release, what would ultimately be that EP. I went to see, I think his name was Bruce Negrin, who worked out of Wild Pitch, and he was like college radio promotion, so he wasn't like an A&R direct, but he was like, come on through, we'll see if we can get it heard to the right people and so forth. So, I mean, the way I approached these labels was as a fan. When I used to have my own tape collection, and it was extensive, I always organized it by record label. All the profile artists would be together, all the jive artists would be together, all the Atlantic artists would be together, and so forth. And I would, as I got to the point where I was an artist myself, I would look at who was on the label in my collection and ponder where I fit in best. what A&R who's signing these guys would be interested in what I'm doing as a rap fan. I was trying to think as a fan how this A&R would interpret what I'm doing. So that's how I did the legwork. I went to New York and tried to make connections before that trip with labels I felt were most likely to embrace what I was doing. And New York was all about New York. I mean, Common ended up getting that deal via Unsigned Hype. So New York, one New York situation embraces him, and then they're open to the idea. Twista was so niche at the time and doing something so unique, that was the reasoning behind him getting his opportunity. Okay, we'll break the Guinness Book of World Records. This will be what this is about. And that, ended up being a challenge for him because a lot of people thought it was very gimmicky. And even though he would go on historically to be one of the greatest rappers ever, he was always one of the greatest rappers ever. But New York didn't understand that.
Right. Well,
so that,
So when you went into Wild Pitch, and for those that don't remember, early on in the game, they had Gangster, they had Chill Rob G, they had Main Source, they had lots of great artists. What was going on with you? Like, what feedback did you get? What did this radio guy do? What happened?
Well, I mean, he listened to the demo and he was cordial enough. He seemed to enjoy it, but I'm sure, I mean, this is pre-search, pre-EMI Wild Pitch. So just let's say as a fan, I'm appreciative of even being in there and seeing how it works, and what Stu Fine has created. And this whole, I looked at it as a huge opportunity just to get heard after a Amtrak trip up there, So I have no experience in the game. I have this good music, but it isn't enough. Furthermore, I'm sure in my very young age and how I look was very odd to them.
Well, I was going to say, in this era, you're from Chicago, strike one, you're white, strike two. Like, how did you get embraced so early in Chicago, and then going to these other cities? And when you started doing these shows, what was the reaction like in this 92 getting into 93 era?
All right, so actually this is 91 going into 92. So this is very early. And as a rap historian, I'm sure you can appreciate there's extremely minimal amount of white artists. I mean, on the production side, it seems to be embraced easier between Rick Rubin and Paul C and Sam Sever and Muggs, Mantronics. I mean, there's a list. And there wasn't a point where they weren't well respected for their craft. But when you are talking about verbiage and speaking on behalf of the culture, at that point, there was very little to go on. Now, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, and Too Deep out west had the white element. I think one of them was white. Adore, Tony D, I think LP may have had a 12-inch around that time. So there's a handful, but nothing from my region. Furthermore, I'm not walking in there saying I'm white. They don't know what I am, just to be upfront about it. If they thought I was Puerto Rican or mixed, or I never got the vibe. To me, I was like approaching it like, man, think about the how you can promote this. You could really, make a killing. I'm thinking on the business end already as a kid. I'm different. But to a certain degree, it was so authentic that it was working against me, that they weren't looking at how they could capitalize on this. They probably were looking at me more like a Prince Power Rule than they were Beastie Boys, or I don't know how they were interpreting what I was doing. But needless to say, it didn't manifest into any record deal from out there. So when I come home, I have some connections, and I'm able to get it manufactured. And we have these connections through college radio. So I'm able to touch a lot of places through these record pools. So fortunately for me, the music was getting heard by people who could spread the word.